The concrete was freezing. It was 14 minutes past 2 in the morning. Deep beneath the Thorn Logistics skyscraper, the underground parking garage was a tomb of damp shadows and echoing silence. Kieran Thorne stood perfectly still. His hand rested naturally over the cold steel tucked inside his tailored overcoat. The Chicago winter was brutal this year. The wind off Lake Michigan howled through the upper streets. But down here, on the lowest executive level, the air was stagnant and heavy with the smell of motor oil and frozen exhaust. Kieran had come down seeking the quiet. He was a man who operated in absolute control. A man whose legitimate multi-billion-dollar corporate front masked a sprawling illicit empire. He controlled the Great Lakes shipping routes. He controlled the untaxed goods moving through the harbor. He controlled the union muscle that kept the city breathing. But right now, his slate-gray eyes were locked on something that did not belong in his meticulously ordered world. Parked in the darkest corner of the VIP sector, tucked behind a massive concrete pillar, was a rusted 2008 sedan. It was a pathetic, dying machine. The rear bumper was held together with silver tape, and the tires were worn dangerously smooth. Kieran moved silently across the concrete. His polished leather shoes made no sound. He did not call for his security detail. He handled anomalies himself. As he approached the driver's side window, he noticed the glass was completely opaque. It was coated in a thick layer of condensation on the inside, frozen into delicate, icy webs on the outside. Someone was breathing in there. Kieran pulled his hand from his coat, leaving the weapon holstered but ready. He raised his bare hand and wiped a clear circle through the frost on the glass. He leaned in, his breath pluming in the freezing air. What he saw made the breath catch in his throat. Curled in the driver's seat, shivering violently under a thin, cheap fleece blanket, was Sloane Mercer, his executive secretary. His iron gatekeeper, the woman who managed his schedules, guarded his secrets, and deflected federal regulators with a terrifying, flawless competence. Right now, she did not look terrifying. She looked small, fragile, and dangerously cold. Her porcelain skin was pale, and her lips carried a faint, terrifying tint of blue. Kieran tapped the glass. It was a sharp, authoritative sound. Inside the car, Sloane jolted awake with a violent gasp. Panic flared in her eyes as she scrambled to sit up, the cheap blanket slipping off her shoulders to reveal her slightly frayed, outdated professional blouse. She fumbled with the keys in the ignition. The engine sputtered, whined, and finally choked to life, blowing a cloud of dark exhaust into the garage. She rolled the window down just a few inches. The freezing air rushed into the cabin, but she tried to maintain her perfect professional mask. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice trembling so hard her teeth clicked together. "I am so sorry. I was just leaving." Kieran stared down at her. His face was an unreadable mask of stone, but his mind was racing. "What are you doing down here, Sloane?" he asked, his deep baritone echoing in the empty concrete cavern. She gripped the steering wheel. Her knuckles were white. "I was working late," she lied smoothly. "I came down to my car to review some files and I must have fallen asleep. It will not happen again." It was a flawless lie, delivered with the practiced ease of a woman who spent her life managing crises. But Kieran was a predator. He saw the truth in the details. He saw the condensation on the windows, which meant she had been breathing in this freezing box for hours. He saw the way her breath hitched, the way her body instinctively curled inward to preserve whatever pathetic warmth she had left. "Go home, Sloane," he said softly. "The roads are icing over." "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," she whispered. She rolled the window up, shifted the dying car into gear, and drove away. Kieran stood in the freezing garage and watched the dim red taillights disappear up the concrete ramp. The seed of suspicion had been planted, and it was taking root deep in his chest. The next morning, the 52nd floor of Thorn Logistics was a fortress of gleaming glass, polished steel, and quiet, ruthless efficiency. Kieran sat behind his massive oak desk. The Chicago skyline stretched out behind him, a jagged horizon of gray clouds and falling snow. The office was soundproof. The silence was absolute. The heavy wooden door opened, and Sloane walked in. She carried a silver tray with his black espresso and the morning briefing files. She looked flawless. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, perfect knot. Her posture was straight, her expression an unreadable mask of professional detachment. But Kieran was no longer looking at the mask. He was looking for the cracks. As she set the espresso on his desk, he watched her hands. They were trembling, just slightly. He looked at her clothes. To the untrained eye, she wore a standard corporate uniform, but Kieran had spent his life evaluating the cost of things. He noticed the slight fraying of the thread on her collar. He noticed the fabric of her skirt was thin, washed too many times, lacking the heavy drape of quality wool. As she turned to walk toward the filing cabinets, he looked at her shoes. Black pumps. Professional. But the heels were worn down to the metal pins, scuffed and polished over a dozen times to hide the damage. "Will you need the harbor manifests for the afternoon meeting?" she asked, her voice steady and clear. "Yes," he said, keeping his eyes on her. "Have them printed and bound by noon." She nodded and walked out of the office, the door clicking shut behind her. Kieran leaned back in his leather chair. The espresso sat untouched, growing cold. Sloane Mercer was the highest-paid executive assistant in the building. He personally ensured her salary was well above the industry standard. She handled millions of dollars in untraceable transfers. She knew the names of the aldermen he bribed. She knew the exact shipping containers that held the untaxed cargo. She was the most valuable asset in his empire. So why was she wearing shoes that were falling apart? Why was she sleeping in a freezing garage at 2 a.m? Kieran picked up his desk phone and pressed a single button. "Send Marcus up here," he said. Now, 10 minutes later, the head of Thorn Logistics Security stood in front of Kieran's desk. Marcus was a massive, scarred man who had spent 10 years breaking legs on the south side before Kieran brought him into the corporate fold. He looked nervous. Kieran Thorn rarely called for him unless someone was about to disappear. "Pull the security logs for the underground executive garage," Kieran ordered, his voice dangerously quiet. Marcus blinked. "The garage, boss?" "Specifically, the keycard swipes for Sloane Mercer," Kieran said. "I want every entry and exit for the last 30 days. I want the camera footage from Sector 4. Marcus nodded quickly. "I can have that for you in 10 minutes. "Do it in 5, Kieran said. When Marcus returned, he carried a thick manila folder and a secure tablet. He placed them on the desk and took a step back. Kieran opened the folder. The data was printed in neat, sterile columns. He traced his finger down the list of timestamps. Monday. Entry at 6:15 in the evening. Exit at 5:30 the next morning. Tuesday. Entry at 6:30 in the evening. Exit at 5:15 the next morning. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. The pattern continued, unbroken, through the weekends. Kieran looked up at Marcus. His slate-gray eyes were cold enough to freeze the blood in the security chief's veins. "Explain this to me," Kieran demanded. Marcus swallowed hard. "She swipes into the garage after the lobby clears out. She parks in the blind spot behind the pillar in Sector 4. The cameras only catch the hood of the car. And the morning exits?" Kieran asked, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "She leaves the garage at 5 a.m, Marcus said. "She drives around the block, parks in the employee surface lot, and walks through the front doors at 6. She uses the executive gym showers on the 3rd floor before coming up to her desk." "How long?" Kieran asked. Marcus looked down at his boots. 21 days, boss. 21 consecutive nights." Kieran stared at the paper. The numbers blurred together. 21 days. The Chicago winter had been merciless. The temperature had dropped below 10 degrees for the last week. The wind chill had been in the negatives. His iron gatekeeper, the woman who held the keys to his empire, had been living in a rusted metal box in a freezing concrete tomb, and she had done it right under his feet. "Leave," Kieran said. Marcus did not hesitate. He turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind him. Kieran sat alone in the silence of his office. A dark, violent anger began to boil in his chest. It was not directed at Sloane. It was directed at the world that had forced her into this, and at himself for not seeing it sooner. He was a man who prided himself on knowing everything. He knew the weaknesses of his enemies. He knew the price of every politician in the city. But he did not know the price his own secretary was paying just to survive. He stood up, walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, and looked down at the city. The streets were clogged with traffic, the sidewalks packed with people fighting the bitter cold. Somewhere out there, something was draining Sloane Mercer dry. Something was taking her money, her warmth, and her dignity. Kieran was not a man who tolerated theft, especially not from his own house. He walked back to his desk and pressed the intercom button. "Sloane," he said, "come into my office. Bring your notepad." The heavy oak door opened. Sloane stepped inside, her posture perfect, her notepad ready. "Close the door," Kieran said. "Lock it." Sloane hesitated for a fraction of a second. It was a micro-expression, a tiny flicker of unease, but Kieran caught it. She turned, engaged the heavy brass deadbolt, and walked toward his desk. "Sit down," he commanded. She sat in the leather chair opposite him. She crossed her legs, resting the notepad on her knee, clicking her pen. "What do you need, Mr. Thorne?" she asked. Kieran leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. He looked at her. Really looked at her, stripping away the professional facade. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, expertly concealed with cheap makeup. He saw the hollows of her cheeks. He saw the exhaustion radiating from her bones. "We need to discuss a security liability," Kieran said smoothly. His voice was calm, clinical, and utterly terrifying. Sloane frowned. "A liability? Has there been a breach in the shipping manifests?" "No," Kieran said. "The breach is internal. It concerns compromised personnel." Sloane sat up straighter. Her pen hovered over the paper. "Who is the target?" "You," Kieran said. The room went dead silent. The acoustic wood paneling absorbed the sound of the wind outside, leaving only the heavy, suffocating tension between them. Sloane stopped breathing. Her eyes widened slightly. "I do not understand," she whispered. Kieran stood up. He walked slowly around the desk, his presence filling the room, crowding her space. "You handle my most sensitive operations, Sloane. You know the routing numbers for the offshore accounts. You know the schedules of the harbor masters. You know where the bodies are buried, both literally and figuratively." He stopped right beside her chair, looking down at her. "A person with that level of access must be stable," he continued, his voice dropping lower. "They must be secure. They cannot be vulnerable to blackmail, bribery, or desperation." "I am not vulnerable," she said quickly, her voice rising in defense. "I have never compromised this company. I have never made a mistake." "You have been living in your car for 21 days, Kieran said. The words hit the room like a physical strike. Sloane flinched. The pen slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the hardwood floor. She stared straight ahead, her face draining of all color. The porcelain mask was cracking, fracturing into 1,000 tiny pieces. Kieran did not stop. He needed to push her over the edge. He needed to break the wall she had built between them. "You sleep in a freezing garage," he said, his voice relentless. "You wash your hair in the lobby gym. You wear shoes that are falling apart. You are starving, Sloane. You are desperate. And in my world, desperation is a liability. It makes you a target." She closed her eyes. Her chest began to heave. "I am giving you one chance to explain yourself," Kieran said, leaning down so his face was inches from hers. "Tell me what is draining your accounts. Tell me who is bleeding you dry, because if you do not, I will fire you right now, and you will never step foot in this building again." It was the threat of losing the job that finally broke her. Sloane's eyes snapped open. The fear was gone, replaced by a sudden, blinding fury. The professional wall shattered completely. She was no longer the perfect executive assistant. She was a woman backed into a corner, fighting for her life. "You want to know what is bleeding me dry?" she demanded, her voice shaking with rage. "You want to know my liabilities?" She stood up, kicking the fallen pen out of the way. She did not back down from him. She stepped closer, her chin tilted up, her eyes blazing with unshed tears. "My brother," she said, the word tearing out of her throat. "Julian. He is 22 years old. 2 years ago, a drunk driver ran a red light and crushed his spine. He suffered a severe traumatic brain injury. He cannot walk. He cannot feed himself. He cannot even breathe without a machine at night." Kieran stood perfectly still, absorbing the impact of her words. "The insurance company cut off his catastrophic coverage 3 months ago," Sloane continued, her voice rising, filling the soundproof room with the raw agony of her reality. "They said he had reached his maximum lifetime benefit. They said his condition was no longer improving, so he was no longer profitable to keep alive." She let out a bitter, broken laugh. "Do you know how much it costs to keep a human being alive in this country, Mr. Thorne? Do you know the brutal arithmetic of survival?" Kieran did not answer. He could not. $4,200 a month, she spat, the number sharp and precise. That is what the Lakeview Neuro Rehab Facility charges just to keep him in a bed, just to turn him every 4 hours so his skin does not rot from bed sores, just to feed him through a tube. Tears finally spilled over her eyelashes, tracking through the cheap makeup, but she did not wipe them away. She let him see her pain. "I sold my furniture," she said, her voice dropping to a ragged whisper. "I sold my winter coat. I emptied my retirement accounts. And then, last month, Vanguard Holdings bought my apartment building in Pilsen. They doubled the rent overnight. They handed out eviction notices to everyone who could not pay." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "I had to choose between keeping a roof over my head or keeping my brother in a facility where he is safe. It was not a choice. I packed my clothes into my car and I left." She stared up at him, her chest heaving, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "So yes, Mr. Thorne, I am desperate. I am starving. I am sleeping in a freezing garage because it is the only way I can keep my brother breathing." She took a step back, her chin held high in a final act of defiance. "If that makes me a security liability, then fire me. Do it right now. I dare you." The silence that followed was deafening. Kieran stood frozen. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with the weight of her confession. He looked at this woman. He looked at the frayed collar, the worn shoes, the trembling hands. She had waged a brutal, silent war against the entire American medical and corporate machine, and she had done it entirely alone. She had protected his empire during the day, and frozen in his basement at night. A strange, unfamiliar tightness gripped Kieran's chest. It was not pity. Pity was a useless emotion. It was a fierce, primal possessiveness. He was a king of the underworld. He protected what was his, and Sloane Mercer was his. He walked slowly back to his desk. He did not look at her. He opened the heavy bottom drawer. Sloane watched him, her breath catching in her throat. She expected him to pull out the termination papers. She expected him to call security and have her escorted out. Instead, Kieran reached into the drawer and pulled out a heavy ring of brass keys. Attached to the ring was a black electronic fob. He walked back around the desk and stopped in front of her. He did not offer her money. He knew her pride would never accept a handout. He knew she would view charity as an insult to her sacrifice. So, he weaponized his authority. He framed his protection as a command. "Catch," he said softly. He tossed the keys. Sloane caught them instinctively, the heavy metal cold against her palm. She looked down at the keys, then up at him, confusion warring with the lingering anger in her eyes. "What is this?" she asked. "That is the key to the corporate penthouse on the Gold Coast," Kieran said, his voice returning to its smooth, terrifying authority. "It is a company asset. It has 3 bedrooms, a heated garage, and a fully stocked kitchen. It is currently sitting empty." Sloane shook her head, trying to hand the keys back. "I cannot accept this. I cannot afford the rent on a place like that." "I did not ask you for rent," Kieran said, his tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. "I am issuing a corporate mandate." He stepped closer, forcing her to look up into his slate-gray eyes. "You are a vital asset to this organization, Sloane. Your current living situation is unacceptable. It compromises your efficiency, and it compromises my peace of mind." He reached out, his large, warm hand wrapping around her cold fingers, closing them tightly over the keys. "You will pack whatever you have in that rusted car. You will move into the penthouse tonight. You will sleep in a warm bed, and you will eat a hot meal." Sloane stared at him, her lips parted in shock. "But Mr. Thorne, if you refuse," Kieran interrupted, his voice dropping to a lethal, velvet whisper, "I will fire you, and then I will personally buy the Lakeview Neuro Rehab Facility and evict your brother." It was a monstrous threat, a calculated cruelty designed entirely to force her compliance. Sloane gasped, her eyes widening in horror, but then she saw the look in his eyes. There was no cruelty there. There was only an absolute, unyielding determination to save her. He was giving her an out. He was giving her permission to stop fighting, just for one night. "Do you understand me, Sloane?" he asked softly. She looked down at his hand, still wrapped around hers. The warmth of his skin was seeping into her frozen bones. She swallowed the knot in her throat. "Yes," she whispered. "I understand." Kieran did not let her drive the rusted sedan. He ordered his security team to tow the vehicle to a scrapyard and transfer her meager belongings to his personal armored SUV. It was late afternoon when they left the Thorne Logistics building. The Chicago sky had turned a bruised, violent purple and heavy snow was falling over Lake Michigan. The drive up Lakeshore Drive was completely silent. Sloane sat in the passenger seat, staring out the tinted window. The heated leather seat was radiating warmth into her aching back. She felt numb, completely overwhelmed by the sudden, violent shift in her reality. Kieran drove with one hand on the steering wheel. He did not speak. He did not offer empty comfort. He simply provided the quiet, secure space she desperately needed. They arrived at the Gold Coast building. It was a towering structure of black glass and steel, a fortress of extreme wealth overlooking the frozen lake. Kieran pulled into the private underground garage. It was brightly lit, immaculately clean, and heated to a comfortable 70 degrees. They rode the private elevator in silence. The numbers ticked upward, climbing higher and higher above the brutal streets of the city. The doors opened on the top floor. Kieran walked her down the wide, carpeted hallway to the heavy mahogany door of the penthouse. He stopped. He did not reach for the door handle. Sloane stepped forward and slid the black electronic fob over the scanner. The lock clicked open with a heavy, satisfying thud. She pushed the door open. Inside, the penthouse was bathed in the warm, golden light of the setting sun. The heating vents hummed softly. Through the massive windows, the snow fell silently over the dark water of the lake. It was a sanctuary. Sloane turned back to look at Kieran. He was standing in the hallway, his hands in the pockets of his overcoat. "Are you coming in?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," Kieran said. He knew that if he crossed that threshold, the dynamic between them would change forever. He knew she needed space to process the end of her brutal, freezing war. "Get some sleep, Sloane," he said softly. "I will see you on Monday." He turned and began to walk away down the long hallway. Sloane stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching his broad shoulders retreat. Then, she stepped inside and pulled the heavy mahogany door shut. Kieran stopped walking. He stood perfectly still in the quiet hallway, listening. He heard the heavy brass deadbolt slide into place. And then, through the thick wood, he heard it. The sound of Sloane Mercer finally breaking down. It was not a quiet, delicate crying. It was the heavy, exhausted, agonizing sobs of a woman who had carried the weight of the world on her shoulders for years, and had finally been allowed to put it down. The sound echoed through the empty hallway, tearing at the silence. Kieran stood there, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. He closed his eyes, listening to the raw, unfiltered sound of her relief. In that quiet, suspended moment, the truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. He controlled the shipping lanes. He controlled the unions. He controlled the dark, beating heart of Chicago. The next morning, the brutal Chicago wind was still howling off Lake Michigan, but inside the 52nd floor of Thorn Logistics, the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. Kieran sat behind his massive oak desk, the city skyline stretching out behind him in a jagged horizon of gray clouds and falling snow. He was reviewing a stack of harbor manifests, but his focus was entirely on the heavy wooden door of his office. At precisely 7 in the morning, the door opened. Sloane walked in. She carried the silver tray with his black espresso and the morning briefing files, just as she had done every single day for the past 3 years. She was still wearing the same slightly frayed, outdated professional clothes. She still had her dark hair pulled back into a severe, perfect knot. But the woman carrying the tray was not the same woman who had been shivering in a rusted sedan 24 hours ago. The change was subtle, but to a predator like Kieran, it was blinding. The terrifying, pale tint of blue was gone from her lips. The hollow, haunted exhaustion that had shadowed her eyes was significantly lighter. For the first time in nearly a month, Sloane Mercer had slept in a warm bed. She had taken a hot shower that did not belong to a corporate gym. She had locked a heavy mahogany door and known, with absolute certainty, that she was safe. She walked across the thick carpet, her posture straight, and set the espresso on his desk. Her hands were not trembling. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne," she said. Her voice was clear, steady, and completely devoid of the desperate edge that had broken his heart the night before. "Good morning, Sloane," he replied, his deep baritone rumbling in the quiet room. He looked up at her. Their eyes met. For a fraction of a second, the professional mask slipped. A silent, heavy current of unspoken gratitude and profound vulnerability passed between them. It was a dangerous shift. The Iron Gatekeeper and the Underworld King were no longer just employer and employee. They were bound by a secret, by a moment of raw surrender in a freezing hallway. Sloane looked away first, clearing her throat softly. "Your first meeting with the union representatives is at 9, she said, tapping the briefing file. "The alderman is expecting your call at 11. Cancel the morning schedule," Kieran said, picking up the espresso. Sloane blinked, her pen hovering over her notepad. "Cancel the union meeting? They have been waiting 3 weeks for this sit-down." "Reschedule it for Monday," Kieran ordered smoothly. "I have an off-site meeting. I will be gone for the rest of the day." Sloane frowned slightly, her mind instantly calculating the logistical fallout. "Where are you going? Do you need me to arrange a driver or prepare a dossier?" "No," Kieran said. He took a slow sip of the dark, bitter coffee. "I am handling this one alone. You stay here. Keep the floor running." "Yes, Mr. Thorne," she said quietly. She turned and walked out of the office. Kieran watched the door click shut. He set the espresso down and stood up. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out over the frozen city. He had given Sloane a warm place to sleep. He had stopped the immediate bleeding. But Kieran Thorne was not a man who applied bandages. He was a man who eliminated the source of the wound. He pulled his heavy wool overcoat from the rack, checked the weight of the steel holstered at his side, and walked out of the office. It was time to buy a life. The drive north out of the city took 45 minutes. Kieran drove his black, armored SUV up Lakeshore Drive, leaving the gritty, industrial harbor of the South Side far behind. The landscape slowly transformed. The towering skyscrapers and crowded, dirty sidewalks gave way to sprawling, snow-covered lawns, wrought iron gates, and the quiet, insulated wealth of the northern suburbs. This was a different kind of underworld. Down in the harbor, men killed each other with crowbars and shipping containers over untaxed cargo. Up here, men killed each other with fountain pens, denial of coverage letters, and profit margins. Kieran pulled through the massive stone gates of the Lakeview Neuro Rehab Facility. It did not look like a hospital. It looked like a luxury resort. The building was a sprawling complex of glass and pale stone, surrounded by manicured winter gardens. This was the pinnacle of the American private healthcare dystopia. It was a place designed to keep the wealthy comfortable while they healed, and to ruthlessly expel anyone whose bank account ran dry. Kieran parked the heavy SUV near the front entrance. He stepped out into the biting cold, his slate-gray eyes locking onto the glass doors. He walked into the lobby. The air inside was warm and smelled faintly of expensive vanilla and sterile bleach. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers. Kieran bypassed the front reception desk entirely. He did not have an appointment, and he did not intend to ask for permission. He walked straight toward the administrative wing, his heavy footsteps sinking into the plush carpet. A young security guard in a blazer stepped into his path, holding up a hand. "Excuse me, sir," the guard said nervously, intimidated by the sheer size and tailored menace of the man approaching him. "You cannot go back there without a visitor pass." Kieran did not stop walking. He did not even look at the guard. "Move," Kieran said. The word was spoken softly, but it carried the lethal, unmistakable weight of a man who was used to breaking bones. The guard took one look at Kieran's eyes, swallowed hard, and stepped aside. Kieran pushed through the heavy double doors of the administrative suite. He walked down the quiet hallway until he found the corner office with a brass plaque that read, "Warren Sterling, Chief Administrator." Kieran opened the door without knocking and stepped inside. Warren Sterling was a man who looked exactly like his title. He was in his late 50s, wearing a tailored suit that was slightly too tight around the middle. He had the slick, nervous energy of a bureaucrat who spent more time on the golf course than in the medical wards. At that exact moment, Sterling was standing in the middle of his expansive office, practicing his putting stroke on a strip of artificial green turf. He looked up, startled, as the heavy door clicked shut. "Excuse me," Sterling said, his face flushing with immediate irritation. "Who are you? My assistant did not announce you." Kieran stood by the door. He took his time, letting the silence stretch out, letting his physical presence fill the room and suffocate the air. He looked at the expensive Persian rug. He looked at the framed degrees on the wall. He looked at the silver golf putter in Sterling's hands. "My name is Kieran Thorne," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Sterling frowned, leaning the putter against his mahogany desk. "Thorne? Are you with the State Medical Board? Because if this is about the recent audit, I have already spoken to the regional director." "I am not with the state," Kieran said. He walked slowly toward the desk. "I am here about a patient. Julian Mercer." Sterling sighed, a sound of profound, bureaucratic exhaustion. He walked behind his desk and sat down, waving a dismissive hand. "Mr. Thorne, I do not know who you are to the Mercer family, but I have already had this conversation with his sister. Repeatedly." Sterling opened a file drawer and pulled out a thin folder, tossing it onto the desk. "Julian Mercer's insurance provider terminated his catastrophic coverage 3 months ago," Sterling said, his tone dripping with practiced corporate sympathy. "He reached his maximum lifetime benefit. His sister has been paying out of pocket, but she is currently 2 weeks delinquent on this month's invoice." Sterling leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "We are a premier facility, Mr. Thorne. We cannot provide top-tier neurological care for free. If the balance is not settled by tomorrow, we will be forced to transfer Julian to a state-run facility. It is simply a matter of economics." Kieran stopped in front of the desk. He looked down at the nervous, sweaty little man who held Julian Mercer's life in his hands. "You view human life as a profit margin, Warren," Kieran said softly. Sterling bristled, his face turning a darker shade of red. "Now see here, I will not be insulted in my own office. I run a business." "You run an extortion racket," Kieran corrected him, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. But that is fine. I understand extortion. I understand leverage. And right now I have all the leverage. Kieran reached into the inside pocket of his overcoat. Sterling tensed, his eyes darting toward the telephone on his desk, suddenly realizing that the man standing in front of him was not a concerned relative. He was a predator. Kieran pulled out a crisp, heavy piece of paper and dropped it onto the center of the mahogany desk. It was a cashier's check, drawn from a secure offshore corporate account. Sterling looked down at the paper. His eyes widened, the color completely drained from his face. He leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up the check. $500,000, Sterling whispered, the numbers catching in his throat. That is a lump sum payment, Kieran said, his slate-gray eyes locking onto Sterling's terrified face. It is an anonymous grant, issued by Thorn Logistics. It will cover Julian Mercer's care for the next 10 years. Sterling swallowed hard, his bureaucratic arrogance completely shattered by the sheer volume of the money sitting in his hands. Mr. Thorn, this is highly irregular. We do not usually accept bulk payments of this size without a structured contract. You are going to accept it, Kieran said. And you are going to follow my exact instructions. Kieran leaned forward, resting his large hands flat on the desk. The wood creaked under his weight. Julian Mercer is currently in a shared room in the standard care wing, Kieran said. By 3 o'clock this afternoon, he will be moved to the private, sunlit suite on the top floor. Sterling nodded frantically. Yes, of course. The top floor suite is available. He will receive round-the-clock, top-tier care, Kieran continued, his voice relentless. He will have the best physical therapists in the state. He will have the best neurological specialists. If a machine breaks, you buy a new one. If he needs a medication that is not covered, you buy it. Kieran leaned closer, until his face was inches from Sterling's. And if I ever find out that his care has been compromised, Kieran whispered, the menace in his voice absolute. If I ever find out that you have cut a corner to save $1, if I ever find out that his sister has been asked to pay a single cent for anything, Kieran let the silence hang in the air, heavy and lethal. I will not send a lawyer, Warren. I will come back here myself, and I will dismantle this facility, and you, piece by piece. Do we have an understanding? Sterling was sweating profusely now. A bead of moisture rolled down his temple. He looked into Kieran's eyes and saw the absolute terrifying truth. This man was not making an empty threat. He was making a promise. Yes, Mr. Thorn, Sterling choked out. Absolute understanding. The account is settled. Julian will be moved immediately. Good, Kieran said. He stood up straight, buttoning his overcoat. Send the zero-balance invoice to Sloan Mercer's office by courier this afternoon, Kieran ordered. Do not mention my name. Do not mention Thorn Logistics. As far as you are concerned, a charitable foundation intervened. Kieran turned and walked toward the door. He did not look back. He left Warren Sterling sitting in his expensive chair, clutching the $500,000 check with trembling hands, terrified of the shadow that had just walked out of his office. Kieran stepped back out into the freezing Chicago air. He climbed into the armored SUV and started the engine. The first problem was solved. Julian Mercer was safe. Sloan's greatest vulnerability had been shielded, but Kieran was not finished. He pulled the SUV out of the facility gates and turned south, heading back toward the towering skyline of the city. Sloan had been bleeding for years. The medical bills were the deep wound, but the eviction was the knife that had finally cut her down. Vanguard Holdings. Bradley Carmichael. Kieran gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. Carmichael was a bottom feeder, a sweaty, predatory corporate landlord who bought up cheap buildings in working-class neighborhoods like Pilsen, handed out immediate eviction notices, and flipped the properties for a massive profit. He was a symbol of systemic greed. He was a man who destroyed lives from the safety of a boardroom, and he had made the fatal mistake of destroying the life of the woman Kieran Thorn protected. Kieran picked up his secure phone and dialed a number. It rang twice before it was answered. Marcus, Kieran said, his voice cold and sharp. Yes, boss, the security chief answered immediately. Assemble the financial acquisition team, Kieran ordered. I want David, Sarah, and the rest of the sharks in the glass boardroom on the 50th floor in 30 minutes. Marcus hesitated for a second. The acquisition team? Boss, we do not have any corporate mergers on the schedule. We are not merging, Kieran said, his eyes fixed on the icy road ahead. We are going hunting. 30 minutes later, the glass boardroom on the 50th floor of Thorn Logistics was a chamber of high-stakes tension. The room was massive, featuring a long mahogany table surrounded by ergonomic leather chairs. The walls were entirely made of glass, offering a dizzying, panoramic view of the frozen city below. 6 of the most ruthless financial analysts in Chicago sat around the table. They wore bespoke suits and carried encrypted tablets. They were the legitimate, terrifying face of Kieran's empire. They did not break legs, they broke companies. Kieran walked into the room. The analysts immediately fell silent. Sitting up straighter, Kieran walked to the head of the table. He did not sit down. He pressed a button on a remote control, and the massive digital screen on the far wall flickered to life. A corporate logo appeared on the screen, Vanguard Holdings. Next to the logo was a photograph of Bradley Carmichael. He was a heavy-set man with a red face, wearing a flashy suit and a smug, arrogant smile. "I want this company," Kieran said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. David, the lead financial analyst, adjusted his glasses and looked at the screen. "Vanguard Holdings," David said, tapping his tablet. "They are a mid-level real estate firm. They specialize in aggressive gentrification. They buy distressed residential properties, evict the lower-income tenants, and renovate for high-yield returns. They are a parasite," Kieran said coldly, "and I want them eradicated." Sarah, a sharp-eyed woman sitting across from David, frowned. "Mr. Thorne, Vanguard is privately held, but they are heavily leveraged. They rely on massive lines of credit from 3 major banks to fund their acquisitions. If we want to buy them out, it will take months of negotiations." "I am not negotiating," Kieran said. "I want a hostile takeover." The room went dead silent. A hostile takeover of a real estate firm this size was a brutal, bloody financial war. It required massive amounts of liquid capital and a willingness to burn money just to watch the other side bleed. "Boss," David said carefully, "if we aggressively buy up their debt and force a buyout, we will be paying 30% above market value. It is a terrible investment. We will lose millions." Kieran leaned forward, resting his hands on the mahogany table. He looked directly at David, his slate-gray eyes completely devoid of mercy. "Did I ask you for investment advice, David?" Kieran asked softly. David swallowed hard, the color draining from his face. "No, sir. I do not care what it costs," Kieran said, his voice rising, filling the room with absolute authority. "I do not care if we lose $10 million. I do not care if we have to buy the banks that hold their credit lines." He pointed a finger at the photograph of Bradley Carmichael. "This man attacked my house," Kieran said, the lie smooth and terrifying. "He evicted someone under my protection. I want his company bled dry. I want his credit lines frozen. I want shell companies buying up every single piece of debt he owes." Kieran stood up straight, looking around the table at his team of sharks. "I want controlling interest of Vanguard Holdings by Friday morning," Kieran commanded. "I want Bradley Carmichael sitting in this exact room, signing away everything he owns. Or I want him facing federal prison for the financial crimes I know you can uncover." The analysts stared at him in stunned silence. They had seen Kieran Thorne destroy rivals before, but it was always calculated. It was always about expanding the empire. This was different. This was not business. This was a slaughter. "Do you understand your instructions?" Kieran asked, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Yes, Mr. Thorne," David said quickly, his fingers already flying across his tablet. "We will begin the acquisition protocols immediately. We will squeeze his credit lines by the end of the day. Do not stop until he is broken," Kieran said. He turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving his financial assassins to begin the execution. Thursday evening. The Chicago winter had escalated into a full-blown blizzard. Outside the thick glass windows of the 52nd floor, the snow was falling in heavy, blinding sheets, swirling violently in the wind. The executive floor was mostly empty. The administrative staff had been sent home early to avoid the dangerous roads. Only 2 people remained. Sloane Mercer sat at her desk in the outer office. The soft glow of her computer monitor illuminated her face. She was typing up the final logistics report for the harbor shipments, but her mind was miles away. She felt strange. She felt light. For the past 3 days, she had lived in the corporate penthouse. She had slept for 8 uninterrupted hours every night. She had eaten hot food. She had stood in a shower that never ran out of hot water. The constant, suffocating panic of survival had been temporarily lifted from her chest, but a new, different kind of anxiety was taking root. She was living in a multi-million-dollar penthouse owned by a man who controlled the Chicago underworld. She was sleeping in his bed. She was eating his food. In the world she grew up in, nothing was free. Every favor had a price. Every gift was a chain. She was terrified of what Kieran Thorne was going to ask for in return. The private elevator chimed softly in the quiet lobby. Sloane looked up as the polished steel doors slid open. A courier stepped out. He was wearing a heavy winter coat covered in snow, holding a thick, cream-colored envelope. "Delivery for Sloane Mercer," the courier said, shaking the snow from his boots. Sloane stood up and walked over to the desk. "I am Sloane Mercer." The courier handed her the envelope, tipped his hat, and stepped back into the elevator. Sloane looked down at the envelope. There was no return address, just her name, printed in elegant, sterile black ink. She recognized the heavy, expensive paper immediately. It was from Lakeview Neuro Rehab. Her heart slammed against her ribs. A cold wave of pure terror washed over her. The invoice. She was 2 weeks late on the monthly payment. She had ignored the calls from the billing department because she had absolutely nothing left to give them. They were kicking Julian out. They were transferring him to a state facility. Her hands began to shake violently. She grabbed a silver letter opener from her desk and sliced the top of the envelope. She pulled out the thick stack of paper. She braced her a Gaussian self for the eviction notice. She braced herself for the final, crushing blow of the medical machine. She unfolded the paper and looked at the top page. It was an invoice, but the numbers were wrong. She blinked, her eyes scanning the columns of text. Patient, Julian Mercer. Room assignment. Top floor private suite. Care level. Maximum tier. Sloane stopped breathing. The private suite? That room cost $10,000 a month. She dragged her eyes down to the bottom of the page, to the final balance line. Previous balance, $8,400. Payment received, $500,000. Current balance, $0. Account status, paid in full for 10 years. Below the numbers, a small note was typed in the margins, funded by an anonymous charitable grant. Sloane stared at the paper. The numbers blurred together as tears instantly filled her eyes. $500,000. Paid in full. For 10 years. Her legs gave out. She collapsed back into her desk chair, the breath tearing out of her lungs in a ragged, desperate gasp. Julian was safe. He was not just safe. He was protected. He was in the best room in the facility. He would never be threatened with eviction again. The 3-year war was over. The brutal arithmetic of her life had been erased in a single stroke. She covered her mouth with her hand, a sob tearing through her throat. But then, the reality of the situation crashed down on her like a physical weight. An anonymous charitable grant. There were no anonymous charities that dropped $500,000 on a single patient without an application, without a board review, without a media campaign. There was only one man in Chicago who had that kind of liquid capital, that kind of terrifying authority, and the knowledge of her exact situation. Kieran. The relief vanished, instantly replaced by a blinding, terrifying panic. He had bought her brother's life. He had spent $500,000 to solve her problem. Sloane gripped the invoice in her hand, crushing the expensive paper. She knew what men like Kieran Thorne did. She managed his books. She knew how he acquired leverage over politicians, union bosses, and rival crews. He found their weakness, he paid their debts, and then he owned them forever. He had just bought her. She was no longer just his employee. She was his property. She owed him a debt she could not possibly repay in 10 lifetimes. A fierce, desperate anger flared in her chest. It was the anger of a woman who had fought too hard for her independence to simply hand it over to a mob boss, even one who had saved her. She stood up, her chair rolling back and slamming into the filing cabinet. She marched across the outer office, her worn heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She reached the heavy oak door of Kieran's office. She did not knock. She grabbed the brass handle, twisted it. The door hit the wall with a loud, violent crack. Kieran was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the blizzard. He was holding a glass of amber whiskey. He turned slowly as Sloane stormed into the room. His face was perfectly calm, an unreadable mask of stone. He had been waiting for this. Sloane marched right up to him. She slammed the crumpled invoice onto his pristine desk. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of absolute fury and profound terror. Kieran looked down at the paper. He took a slow sip of his whiskey. "It appears to be a medical invoice," he said smoothly. "Do not play games with me, Kieran," she snapped, using his first name for the very first time. The professional boundary was completely obliterated. "You went to Lakeview. You paid them $500,000. "I did," Kieran said simply. He set the whiskey glass down on the desk. "Why?" she yelled, the sound echoing off the acoustic wood paneling. "Why would you do that?" "Because you could not," Kieran replied, his voice calm, refusing to rise to her anger. "Because they were going to throw your brother onto the street, and you were going to freeze to death in a parking garage trying to stop it. Sloane threw her hands up, pacing away from the desk, her chest heaving. You cannot just buy my life, she cried out, spinning back to face him. Do you understand what you have done? I owe you everything. I owe you a debt I can never, ever repay. She pointed a trembling finger at him. I know how your world works. I know what happens when you buy someone's debt. What is the price, Kieran? What do you own now? Do you own me? Am I just another asset on your ledger? The silence in the room was deafening. The only sound was the howling wind beating against the thick glass. Kieran stared at her. The calm, unreadable mask finally cracked. A dark, fierce emotion flared in his slate-gray eyes. It was not anger. It was a deep, agonizing pain that she would ever view his protection as a cage. He stepped away from the window. He closed the distance between them with slow, deliberate, predatory steps. Sloane instinctively backed up, her heart hammering in her throat. She retreated until her back hit the heavy acoustic wood paneling of the wall. She was trapped. Kieran stopped just inches away from her. His massive frame blocked out the light from the desk lamp, casting her in his shadow. The scent of cedar, cold air, and expensive whiskey wrapped around her, suffocating and intoxicating. He raised his hands and placed them flat against the wood paneling, one on either side of her head. He did not touch her, but his physical presence was overwhelming. He leaned down, his face so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. Listen to me very carefully, Sloane, he whispered. His gravelly baritone was stripped of all corporate authority. It was raw, primal, and fiercely tender. There is no debt. Sloane stared up at him, her breath catching in her throat. Her eyes were wide, searching his face for the lie, for the hidden trap. But there was no trap. I do not buy people, Kieran said softly, his eyes locked onto hers. I destroy people. I buy politicians, I buy companies. But I do not buy you. He slowly lifted his right hand from the wall. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. A man who commanded thousands, suddenly terrified of frightening the woman in front of him. Then, he gently pressed his palm against her cheek. His hand was large, warm, and slightly rough. It was the hand of a man who had built an empire with violence, now touching her as if she were made of fragile glass. Sloane gasped softly at the contact. A violent shiver ran down her spine, but she did not pull away. She leaned into his warmth, completely entirely against her own will. For 3 years, Kieran whispered, his thumb slowly tracing the line of her jaw. For 3 years you have stood outside my door. You have guarded my secrets. You have protected my empire from the police, from the feds, from rival crews. You have been my iron gatekeeper. He stepped closer, his chest brushing against hers. You have protected me, Sloane. And now, I am claiming the right to protect you. Tears spilled over her eyelashes, tracking down her cheeks, wetting his thumb. I do not want to be owned, she whispered, her voice breaking. I have fought too hard to survive. I do not want you to survive, Kieran said, his voice dropping to a fierce, desperate plea. I want you to live. I want you to stop fighting the entire world by yourself. He leaned his forehead against hers. The physical contact was grounding, an anchor in the middle of the storm. Let me carry the weight, he whispered. Let me be the reason you live. Sloane closed her eyes. The frantic, desperate mental calculations that had driven her every waking moment for the past 3 years suddenly stopped. The brutal arithmetic of poverty, the fear of eviction, the terror of the medical bills. It all vanished, burned away by the absolute, unyielding heat of the man standing in front of her. She opened her eyes and looked into his dark slate gaze. She saw the truth. He was not laying a trap. The apex predator of Chicago was laying his own heart bare, offering her the one thing she had never had, absolute safety. Instead of pushing him away, Sloane slowly raised her hands. She reached up and gripped his thick wrists, her small fingers wrapping around the cuffs of his tailored shirt. She anchored herself to him, holding on as if he were the only solid thing left in the world. She took a deep, shuddering breath, accepting the end of her war. Okay, she whispered. It was a singular, life-altering word. A complete surrender, not to a master, but to a partner. Kieran let out a long, heavy breath, the tension draining from his massive shoulders. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her flush against his chest, burying his face in her dark hair. Friday morning broke over Chicago with the sharp, blinding clarity that only follows a brutal blizzard. The sky was a piercing, frozen blue, and the city below was buried under 2 feet of pristine white snow. But inside the glass boardroom on the 50th floor of Thorne Logistics, The atmosphere was anything but peaceful. It was a theater of absolute, terrifying power, prepared for a public execution. Kieran Thorne sat at the head of the long mahogany table. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the light in the room. His broad shoulders were relaxed, his posture completely still. He was the apex predator, waiting patiently in the center of his web. Sitting immediately to his right was Sloane Mercer. She was no longer the desperate, exhausted woman shivering in a freezing parking garage. The frayed, outdated professional clothes were gone. She wore a tailored black dress, sharp and unforgiving, cut from heavy, expensive wool. Her dark hair was pulled back, not in a severe knot of anxiety, but in a sleek, flawless crown of authority. Her porcelain skin had regained its color. Her eyes were clear, cold, and focused. She had slept in absolute safety. She had surrendered the crushing weight of her survival to the man sitting beside her, and in return, he had forged her into a weapon. At precisely 9 a.m, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. Bradley Carmichael walked in. He was the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. He was a heavy-set man in his late 40s, his face flushed red from the biting cold outside, and his own inflated sense of importance. He wore a flashy, navy blue suit with a wide pinstripe, a gold watch thick enough to double as a weapon, and a smug, arrogant smile. He was a man who made his fortune by buying distressed properties in working-class neighborhoods, doubling the rent overnight, and handing out immediate eviction notices to families who could not fight back. He was a parasite in a silk tie, and he had absolutely no idea he was walking into a slaughterhouse. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne," Bradley said, his voice booming too loudly in the quiet room. He walked toward the table, extending a thick, sweaty hand. Kieran did not stand up. He did not reach out to take the hand. He simply stared at Bradley with slate-gray eyes that held all the warmth of a frozen lake. "Sit down, Bradley," Kieran said. His deep baritone voice was smooth, quiet, and completely devoid of welcome. Bradley hesitated, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second. He slowly pulled back his hand, cleared his throat, and took a seat halfway down the long table. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and leaned back, trying to project an air of relaxed confidence. "I have to admit, Mr. Thorne, I was surprised to get your call," Bradley said, lacing his fingers together over his stomach. "Vanguard Holdings has always operated independently, but when a titan like Thorne Logistics reaches out to discuss a waterfront development partnership, I am always willing to listen." Kieran let the silence stretch. He let it stretch until the quiet in the room became heavy, suffocating, and deeply uncomfortable. Bradley shifted in his ergonomic leather chair. The leather squeaked loudly. A single bead of sweat formed at his hairline. "We are not here to discuss a partnership," Kieran finally said. Bradley frowned, his thick eyebrows drawing together. "Then why did you summon me here? If this is about the South Side zoning permits, my people have already secured the alderman." "I am not interested in your zoning permits," Kieran said. "I am interested in your company." Kieran reached out and placed a thick, black leather folder on the polished mahogany wood. He slid it down the length of the table. The folder stopped exactly in front of Bradley. "Open it," Kieran commanded. Bradley looked at the folder, then up at Kieran, a flicker of genuine unease finally breaking through his arrogance. He reached out with thick fingers and flipped the leather cover open. He stared at the top page. It was a financial summary, printed in sterile black ink. Bradley began to read. As his eyes darted across the columns of numbers, the flush of color completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, pale gray. "What is this?" Bradley whispered, his voice suddenly hoarse. "That is a ledger of your absolute ruin," Kieran said softly. Bradley flipped to the second page, his hands beginning to tremble violently. "These are my corporate credit lines," Bradley stammered, panic rising in his throat. "These are the commercial mortgages for every property Vanguard owns." "They were your credit lines," Kieran corrected him. "As of 6 o'clock this morning, they belong to a network of shell companies controlled by Thorne Logistics." Bradley looked up, his eyes wide with shock and terror. "You bought my debt? All of it? That would cost tens of millions of dollars above market value. It makes no financial sense." "I did not do it to make a profit, Bradley," Kieran said, leaning forward slightly, the lethal menace in his voice finally bleeding through. "I did it to break you." Bradley swallowed hard, his gold watch clinking against the table as his hands shook. "Why? We have never crossed paths. Vanguard has never interfered with your shipping routes. We are in real estate. We are in different worlds." "You bought a residential building in Pilsen last month," Kieran said. Bradley blinked, desperately trying to process the information. "Pilsen?" Yes, we acquired a block of distressed apartments. It was a standard gentrification flip. We issued the standard 30-day eviction notices to clear the building for luxury renovations. It is just business. Kieran stood up. The sheer physical size of the man seemed to suck the oxygen out of the massive boardroom. He walked slowly down the length of the table, his footsteps completely silent on the thick carpet. He stopped right behind Sloane's chair. He placed his large, powerful hands on the back of her leather seat. It was a gesture of absolute possession, a physical declaration of his protection. "You issued an eviction notice to the woman sitting to my right," Kieran said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, gravelly whisper. Bradley slowly turned his head to look at Sloane. Until this exact moment, he had not even registered her presence. He had assumed she was just a secretary, a piece of corporate furniture meant to take notes and pour coffee. Now, he looked into her eyes. Sloane stared back at him. Her face was a flawless mask of icy detachment, but her dark eyes burned with the quiet, devastating triumph of a woman watching her monster be led to the slaughter. "She is your secretary," Bradley choked out, his mind fracturing under the weight of his catastrophic mistake. "She is my iron gatekeeper," Kieran said, "and you attacked my house." Bradley pushed his chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the floor. He stood up, his chest heaving, sweat pouring down his face. "You cannot do this," Bradley shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "You cannot destroy a legitimate company over a single apartment lease. It is illegal. I will call the state attorney. I will call the federal regulators." Kieran did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Call them," Kieran said smoothly. He gestured to the black folder on the table. "Turn to page 4, Bradley." Bradley looked down. His trembling fingers fumbled with the heavy paper. He flipped to the 4th page. "My financial acquisition team spent the entire night going through your private ledgers," Kieran explained, his tone clinical and merciless. "They found the offshore accounts. They found the wire fraud. They found the kickbacks you paid to the housing inspectors to condemn buildings you wanted to buy cheap." Bradley stopped breathing. The paper slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the table. "You are a parasite, Bradley," Kieran said, "and today you are going to be eradicated." Kieran walked back to the head of the table. He reached into the inside pocket of his charcoal suit and pulled out a single, crisp sheet of paper. He slid it down the table. It came to rest right on top of the black folder. "That is a letter of resignation," Kieran said. "It signs over your controlling shares of Vanguard Holdings to Thorn Logistics. It forfeits your severance package. It strips you of every asset tied to the company." Bradley stared at the paper as if it were a loaded gun. "If I sign this, I am bankrupt," Bradley whispered, tears of pure panic welling in his eyes. "I will lose my homes. I will lose everything." "If you do not sign it," Kieran said, his slate-gray eyes locking onto Bradley with absolute, unyielding cruelty, "I will hand page 4 over to the federal prosecutor. You will face 20 years in a federal penitentiary." Kieran let the silence hang in the air for 3 agonizing seconds. "And Bradley," Kieran added softly, "you are a soft, sweaty man who evicts single mothers for a living. You will not survive 20 years in federal prison." Bradley collapsed back into his chair. He buried his face in his hands. A pathetic, broken sob tore out of his throat. The titan of corporate real estate, the man who had destroyed hundreds of lives with the stroke of a pen, was completely shattered. He reached out with a shaking hand and picked up the heavy gold pen resting on the table. He pressed the nib to the paper. He signed his name. The signature was a jagged, desperate scrawl. Bradley pushed the paper away, staring blankly at the mahogany wood, his empire completely dissolved. Sloane stood up. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace. She walked down the length of the table, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She stopped next to Bradley. She did not look at him with pity. She looked at him the way one looks at a crushed insect. She reached out and picked up the resignation letter. She checked the signature, ensuring it was legally binding. Then, she looked down at the broken man in the chair. "You have 30 minutes to clear out your office, Mr. Carmichael," Sloane said. Her voice was perfectly smooth, carrying the exact, terrifying cadence of the man who had trained her. Bradley looked up at her, his face streaked with sweat and tears. Sloane smiled. It was a sharp, dangerous, beautiful smile. "Security will escort you out," she added. She turned and walked back to Kieran, handing him the paper. The execution was complete. The ledger of her survival had been wiped clean, and the man who had tried to destroy her was nothing more than a ghost in a cheap suit. Saturday morning arrived with a brilliant, blinding winter sun reflecting off the frozen surface of Lake Michigan. Kieran drove his black, armored SUV north out of the city. Sloane sat in the passenger seat. She was wearing a heavy, luxurious cashmere coat that Kieran had ordered delivered to the penthouse the night before. The drive was quiet, but it was not the heavy, suffocating silence of fear. It was the comfortable, resonant silence of two people who had fundamentally shifted the axis of their world. They pulled through the massive stone gates of the Lakeview Neuro Rehab facility. Kieran parked the heavy vehicle near the front entrance. He turned off the engine and looked over at Sloane. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. Sloane took a deep breath, her hands resting in her lap. She nodded. They walked through the glass doors into the warm, vanilla-scented lobby. Warren Sterling, the chief administrator, was waiting for them near the reception desk. When he saw Kieran walk through the doors, the nervous little bureaucrat practically folded himself in half. "Mr. Thorne, Miss Mercer," Sterling said, his voice trembling with a mixture of extreme deference and lingering terror. "Welcome back. Everything is prepared exactly as you requested." Sloane did not even look at him. She walked right past the administrator, her eyes fixed on the elevator banks. Kieran followed her, casting a single, warning glance at Sterling that kept the man rooted to the floor. They rode the elevator to the top floor. The doors opened into a wide, quiet corridor. The floors were polished hardwood, not sterile linoleum. The lighting was soft and warm. Sloane walked down the hall until she reached the heavy oak door at the very end. A small brass plaque on the wall read, "Julian Mercer, Private Suite." Sloane reached out and pushed the door open. She stepped inside, and the breath completely left her lungs. The room was massive. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, panoramic view of the snow-covered gardens and the frozen lake beyond. Sunlight poured into the space, bathing everything in a golden glow. In the center of the room was a state-of-the-art, specialized neurological hospital bed. Julian was lying there. He was 22 years old, but the traumatic brain injury had left his face slack, his eyes staring blankly toward the window. But he was not neglected. He was wearing clean, soft cotton clothes. His skin looked healthy. A dedicated private nurse sat in a comfortable chair near the bed, reading a book aloud in a soothing voice. The terrifying rhythmic hiss of the cheap ventilator he used to need was gone, replaced by a silent, cutting-edge respiratory support system. The nurse looked up as they entered, smiled warmly, and quietly stepped out of the room to give them privacy. Sloane walked slowly toward the bed. She reached out and gently took her brother's hand. His fingers were warm, his nails were neatly trimmed. For 3 years, every time she looked at Julian, she had felt a crushing, suffocating wave of panic. She had looked at him and seen a ticking clock, a countdown to the day the money would run out and the system would throw him away. Now, she looked at him and saw only peace. The war was truly, finally over. Sloane fell to her knees beside the bed. She pressed Julian's hand to her cheek, and she began to weep. It was not the exhausted, broken sobbing from the hallway of the penthouse. It was a quiet, profound release. It was the sound of a soul shedding 1,000 pounds of armor. Kieran stood near the door, giving her the space she needed. He watched her, his slate-gray eyes softening. The ruthless mob boss completely, entirely replaced by a man fiercely devoted to the woman on the floor. After a long time, Sloane stood up. She kissed her brother's forehead, wiped her eyes, and walked out of the room. Kieran followed her into the quiet, sunlit hallway. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind them. Sloane stopped in the middle of the corridor. She turned to face Kieran. She looked up at his broad shoulders, his tailored coat, his hard, handsome face. He had not just saved her brother. He had burned down the man who evicted her. He had given her a fortress to sleep in. He had stripped away her desperation and replaced it with absolute power. "Kieran," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He took a step closer, his hands resting lightly on his hips. "Yes." Sloane did not say thank you. Thank you was a word for holding a door or pouring a cup of coffee. It was entirely insufficient for what he had done. Instead, she reached up, grabbed the heavy wool lapels of his overcoat, and pulled him down to her. She kissed him. It was not a gentle, hesitant kiss. It was desperate, fierce, and completely consuming. It was a physical transfer of gratitude, of raw desire, and of absolute surrender. Kieran groaned, a deep, gravelly sound that vibrated in his chest. His massive arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her slightly off the floor, pulling her flesh against his solid frame. He kissed her back with a primal, possessive hunger, claiming her right there in the quiet hallway of the hospital. He tasted like dark espresso, winter air, and absolute safety. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing heavily. Kieran rested his forehead against hers, his hands gripping her waist, refusing to let her go. "You are mine now," Kieran whispered, his voice a fierce, tender rumble. Sloane looked up into his eyes. She did not feel trapped. She did not feel owned. She felt invincible. "I know," she whispered back. Weeks later, the biting December winter had fully set in. The city of Chicago was locked in a deep freeze. The streets were slick with black ice, and the wind chill had dropped well below zero. It was late Friday evening. The 52nd floor of Thorne Logistics had emptied out hours ago. Sloane Mercer stepped out of the private executive elevator into the underground parking garage. The garage was exactly as it had been on that fateful night weeks ago. It was a tomb of damp shadows, echoing silence, and the smell of frozen exhaust. But Sloane was not walking toward a rusted, dying sedan. She was walking toward a sleek, black luxury coupe that Kieran had permanently assigned to her. She was wearing a heavy, tailored winter coat, leather gloves, and expensive boots. Her heels clicked sharply against the freezing concrete. She was halfway to her car when a shadow detached itself from the massive concrete pillar in Sector 4. "Hold it right there, sweetheart," a voice echoed in the empty garage. Sloane stopped. She did not gasp. She did not flinch. She slowly turned her head. A man stepped into the dim overhead light. It was Rocco. He was a low-level, greasy enforcer for a rival Southside Chicago outfit. He wore a cheap leather jacket over a stained hoodie. He smelled of stale cigarette smoke, cheap cologne, and nervous sweat. He was holding a heavy steel crowbar, tapping it rhythmically against his leg. A second thug stepped out from behind a parked van a few yards away. He was younger, twitchy, and holding a switchblade knife. They had bypassed the outer security perimeter. They had slipped into the executive garage to send a message. "Well, well, well," Rocco sneered, showing a row of yellowed teeth. "Look at the pretty little secretary. Moving up in the world, are we?" Sloane stood perfectly still. A month ago, this situation would have terrified her. A month ago, she was a vulnerable, exhausted woman living in her car, terrified of her own shadow. But Rocco did not realize he was not dealing with a secretary anymore. He was dealing with a woman who had watched the apex predator of Chicago dismantle a corporate empire just to make her smile. He was dealing with a woman who had been forged in the fires of Kieran Thorne's absolute authority. "What do you want, Rocco?" Sloane asked. Her voice was icy, detached, and completely devoid of fear. Rocco laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Your boss has been stepping on our shipping routes down at the harbor," Rocco said, taking a slow step toward her. "He has been getting a little too greedy. Our boss decided it was time to send Thorne a message." Rocco raised the crowbar, pointing the curved steel tip at her face. "We figured breaking his favorite little toy would get his attention," Rocco said, his eyes gleaming with cruel intent. Sloane did not back away. She did not scream for help. She slowly reached her gloved hand into her expensive leather tote bag. Rocco tensed, gripping the crowbar tighter. "Hey, keep your hands where I can see them. You pulling a phone? You think you have time to call the cops?" "I am not calling the police," Sloane said smoothly. Her fingers found the small, heavy black device hidden in the lining of her bag. It was a silent panic button, hardwired directly to the Thorne Logistics central security grid, and more importantly, directly to Kieran's personal phone. She pressed the button. She pulled her empty hand out of the bag and let it rest at her side. "You boys made a very serious miscalculation tonight," Sloane said, her voice echoing calmly in the concrete tomb. Rocco frowned, glancing at his twitchy partner, then back at Sloane. "What are you talking about, crazy lady? There is nobody down here but us." Sloane tilted her head slightly, looking at Rocco with a mixture of clinical pity and absolute disdain. "You think you are hunting a secretary," Sloane said. "But you just walked into a vault. And you locked the door behind you." She took a slow, deliberate step toward the man with the crowbar. Rocco instinctively took a half step back, unnerved by the complete lack of fear in her eyes. "When I pressed the button in my bag," Sloane explained, her voice dropping to a terrifying, conversational murmur, "it initiated a priority 1 lockdown on this facility. The steel blast doors on the exit ramps have already engaged. You cannot drive out. You cannot walk out." The twitchy thug with the knife looked nervously toward the exit ramp. The heavy steel doors were indeed sliding shut with a distant mechanical grinding sound. "Hey, Rocco," the younger thug stammered. "The doors are closing." "Shut up," Rocco snapped, trying to maintain his bravado. "She is bluffing. It is just a security guard. I will crack his skull too." "It is not a security guard," Sloane said. She looked at her expensive wristwatch. "Kieran was in his office on the 52nd floor," Sloane continued, her voice perfectly steady. "The private elevator takes exactly 90 seconds to reach this level." Rocco swallowed hard. The greasy confidence was beginning to curdle into genuine panic. "He will not ask you questions, Rocco," Sloane said, her dark eyes locking onto his. "He will not negotiate. He will step out of that elevator, and he will inflict brutal, catastrophic anatomical damage on both of you." She pointed a gloved finger at the crowbar. "He will take that piece of steel from your hands. He will shatter your left kneecap. Then he will shatter your right. He will sever your Achilles tendons so you can never walk onto his territory again. And then he will let his security team clean up whatever is left of you." The garage was dead silent. The psychological break was absolute. Rocco stared at the woman in front of him, realizing with horrifying clarity that she was not a victim. She was the bait, and the trap was already springing shut. A loud electronic chime echoed through the garage. The polished steel doors of the private executive elevator slid open. The screech of heavy tires tore through the silence as Kieran's black, armored SUV launched out of the elevator bay. The massive vehicle roared across the concrete, the headlights blinding in the dim garage. It slammed on the brakes, skidding to a violent halt just 20 feet away. The driver's side door flew open. Kieran Thorne leaped out. He was moving with terrifying, lethal speed. His heavy wool overcoat flared out behind him. In his right hand, he held a matte black semi-automatic weapon, already raised and locked onto Rocco's chest. His slate-gray eyes were wide, wild, and filled with pure, unadulterated murder. He was a fraction of a second away from pulling the trigger and painting the concrete wall with Rocco's blood. "Stop." Sloane's voice rang out, sharp and commanding, cutting through the violent tension like a blade. "Kieran froze." His finger hovered over the trigger. His chest heaved as he looked past the thugs, his eyes locking onto Sloane to ensure she was unharmed. Sloane stood perfectly still, her chin held high. She looked at Kieran, and then she looked back at the two terrified men. "Drop the weapons," Sloane ordered. The twitchy thug dropped his switchblade instantly. It clattered loudly against the concrete. Rocco's hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold the crowbar. He looked at the massive, lethal titan aiming a gun at his heart. And then he looked at the icy, untouchable woman who had orchestrated his complete psychological destruction. The crowbar slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a heavy clang. "Get out of my garage," Sloane said softly. Rocco and his partner did not hesitate. They turned and ran, sprinting desperately toward the emergency stairwell, their footsteps echoing wildly as they fled in absolute terror. Kieran watched them go, his jaw clenched tight. Slowly, he lowered the weapon. He engaged the safety and slid it back into the shoulder holster beneath his coat. He turned to look at Sloane. He had rushed down here expecting to find his world tearing apart. He had expected to find her terrified, cornered, and in need of rescue. Instead, he found her standing in the freezing concrete tomb, completely untouched, having broken two hardened street enforcers with nothing but her voice and her absolute certainty in his protection. She had not just survived his dark, violent world. She had mastered it. Kieran walked slowly across the concrete. He stopped in front of her. He reached out, his large hands gently framing her face, his thumbs brushing over her cold cheeks. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his gravelly voice thick with lingering adrenaline. "No," she whispered, leaning into his touch. "I knew you were coming." Kieran let out a long, heavy breath. A slow, proud smile spread across his hard face. He looked at the woman who had once shivered in a rusted car, terrified of the world. Now, she stood in the center of his empire, commanding the shadows with a single word. He dropped his hands, stepped back, and offered her his arm. Sloane smiled. She slipped her gloved hand through the crook of his elbow, anchoring herself to the man who had burned down the world to keep her warm. They turned and walked together toward the waiting elevator. The Iron Gatekeeper was gone forever. The undisputed queen of the empire had finally ascended her throne.